welcome back to the show. So, like I mentioned in the intro, today we have a really interesting guest, Johnny Crowder from Cope Notes. Johnny, welcome to the show.
I am happy to be here. I'm also jealous of your Oasis shirt. My guitarist is like shamelessly fanboying over Oasis the last couple years. And it's crazy how they've been tied to the one song, but they're kind of legendary across the board.
Well, I think a lot of things are in play right now because they seem to have like this resurgence. And part of it is like, everyone's like, we want the reunion, because reunions are so big. I mean, part of it is just they're such an incredible band. There's that renewed interest. I think like the Gallaghers are so brutal on the internet, especially like Liam is just like, man, he's just brutal. And everyone loves it. But I'll tell you the thing that I think was hilarious is when like Foo Fighters were like, let's get Oasis. Like, Dave Grohl, who the hell do you think you are? You're going to get the Oasis back together. And they just like blew up his spot. They like made fun of him till they shot him down. And I think that kind of like endeared people to Oasis. Like, not that they weren't, but it renewed interest of them just kind of like digging at Dave Grohl. I don't have anything bad to say about Dave Grohl, but he's kind of, he's that guy that's in like every documentary about music. And I think people are just kind of like, enough of this guy already. So I kind of feel like their shot at Dave Grohl, like, took him up.
Dude, the one thing that I heard from Dave Grohl that I always appreciated was people asked, this must have been a decade ago or more, but they were like, how do you manage to, stay humble when you were in Nirvana, which is like one of the most iconic bands of all time, and then you wind up being in the Foo Fighters, which becomes huge. And he said, something that always helps me stay grounded is when I go home, my daughter's like, Daddy, clean my diaper. Or like,
Yeah.
Daddy, I need help with pouring some juice. And he's like, I'm not a rock star in my house. And it helps keep me sane. And I don't know him or anything, but that's always stuck with me. Like, you need people in your life who will treat you like a normal person, regardless of what your career looks like,
Yeah. And I think for like mega stars like that, that's got to be tough because they're also so surrounded by people who make things happen for them, like, nannies or like, assistants or all these things. That to be able to get that just real life experience that grounds you, it's got to be tough. Dave Grohl, by all accounts, seems like a cool guy. I don't know. I haven't met him. Don't anticipate I'm going to meet him. But, Dave Grohl, if you happen to hear this, good for you. Anyways, all right, let's talk about you, man. Let's talk about Cope Notes. So real interesting model. So for people who don't know, tell us about Cope Notes. Tell us about what it is and how it started.
So short version, I always tell people the long version is
Mm-hmm.
I gave a TED talk and it's 18 minutes, no detail spared. That's where you want to go for the like lowdown. But
Mm-hmm.
the short version is I grew up with a number of mental illnesses,
Mm-hmm.
in and out of treatment, trying to figure out what was going to work for me. Basically, really frustrated with a lot of things that I used. So I wanted to create something that could fill gaps. I would go to therapy and then maybe I'd make progress, maybe I wouldn't. And then for 6 days and 23 hours, I would backslide. So
Yeah.
I needed something a little more, instead of one big thing once a week, I needed like a few little things per day sprinkled throughout my week so that I could stay on top of my mental health. So
Mm-hmm.
I created Cope Notes to be that. And essentially what we do is we provide daily mental health support via text message, and each
Mm-hmm.
text combines peer support and positive psychology to train the brain to interrupt negative thought patterns and replace them with healthier ones.
Okay. So when I think of this from a therapeutic model, and again, for anyone listening, I feel like I don't like bringing this up all the time, but I bring it up just for the conversation. So for anyone listening, of course, my background is as a therapist. I worked in addiction and mental health for a decade. So with that said, if I think about a therapeutic model of like outpatient care, where people are like out in the community living, they see a therapist maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, maybe once a month. But on the rest of that time, they don't have a support network. And that's where a lot of things traditionally like AA would come in, or like mental health groups, 12-step groups or recovery groups. And those things have a lot of success, but also a lot of critique about how maybe they weren't as successful or useful, or even how like the user base of those is changing, because we're in this world now where people have so much access to things like, the internet, cell phones, like all of that kind of stuff. So what gave you the actual idea to do it this way?
Well, it was a combination of some of the stuff that you mentioned, but also feeling like relying on my own initiative didn't always work. Like I would say, somebody would get me a book. I actually had a girlfriend at the time who was trying to be very sweet, and she bought me a book that was supposed to help me with my OCD.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't touch that book because the book requires me to take initiative, make a conscious decision to open the book, read it, and not let my mind drift. And same with going to groups. Like, you want me to go to a group? I have to get in my car. First, I have to put on clothes, get in my car, choose to plan my day or week around going to a group. And it was such a heavy lift that it felt like kind of like saying to someone with a broken ankle, like, wow, that seems really painful. Why don't you just climb to the top of Mount Everest? There's a great clinic up there that can fix your ankle. And you're like, well,
Right.
the problem is I'm at the bottom of a mountain with a broken ankle. So ultimately, what I wanted to do is make something that would take the first step for you so that you
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have to make the conscious decision to engage.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about it in the TED Talk, but it started in a very rudimentary way. I just wrote out a short couple of sentences that I thought would be helpful to hear, like I would like to hear them. And then I sent the same text copied and pasted to like 30 people in my phone book
Mm-hmm.
just to see what would happen. And all of these people started texting back saying, like, how did you know I needed to hear that? And wow, that was so relevant. And I thought, I didn't know that it was relevant. I don't know what's going on in your life, but it showed me that the brain's ability to interpret is much more powerful than my ability to predict, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it starts with just, hey, I want to hear these things. I'm going to send them to 30 people. Really positive response to it. Then what happens?
Well, then I had no idea what I was doing, right? Because just so people understand my background, so I went to school for psychology, not for business.
Mm-hmm.
So I like was not planning on creating a business ever really in my life. I've worked in creative almost my entire life. And so I thought, well, shoot, I have something cool that I want to make. So what I did is maybe like the messiest beta version of any product ever. So what I
Mm-hmm.
did was I Googled um, SMS marketing software. And I Googled all this stuff about like engagement rate for text messages versus making an app, because making an app would have been expensive and I was scared. And then I Googled SMS marketing software and I thought, shoot, I'll manually send these messages out and I'll use a Google voice number to manually copy and paste messages to people. And I actually met an enterprise partner of ours now not too long ago for lunch, and they said, I got to be honest, when I first tried Cope Notes it was so bad. And I'm like, I bet you're right, because I was like chicken with my head cut off at that point.
Totally, man. So what year was all this? Did all this start?
So I started working on a beta version of Cope Notes called Not a Therapist,
Mm-hmm.
and it was all based on peer support, and that
Mm-hmm.
was 2017. And then the beta version of Cope Notes as we know it today was launched in February, late February, early March of 2018. So it took like 9 months in the market of people telling me what they liked and didn't like for me to get to a crappy version that enterprise partner that I mentioned used.
Yeah. Well, but it's also relatively short ramp up time. So if we're thinking about a company that's like a viable company now, what's interesting to me, well, there's a lot of things interesting, but the key thing that it keeps standing out to me is time and time again, we see innovation coming from people who are the initial audience. Like it's someone who's just a person going about their life in whatever way, and they're utilizing something. In this case, it's like a therapeutic structure, and they're saying, "Man, there's gaps here. It could be better." But there's no one within the industry creating that for all sorts of reasons. And I mean, there's a lot of like incredible social services, a lot of incredible therapists, but their jobs are doing that, where you have someone who's a user of those services saying like, hey, this isn't working, or it could be better. And in fact, why don't I just do it? We're seeing more and more how much innovation in the business world is coming from people who are just end users saying like, this could be better. And they're also hijacking the system. They're not waiting for permission and being like, well, who am I to do that? I'm not a therapist. You literally called your thing not a therapist, right? And like, I love it. I love that, not asking permission, going out and doing it, and then a relatively short ramp up time. Like, you started this in 2017 in its most basic form. 2000, did you say 18? It was launching as Cope Notes?
Yeah, that was when it was like rebranded as like, this is a thing that you can sign up for, and I like pushed the website live and stuff.
Yeah. So what was the response initially?
Well, there was the thing that I ran before Not a Therapist was, you got to keep in mind, telehealth wasn't as embraced as it is today. So like 2017, people were like on the therapy on the phone. And I had to, one of my hurdles was saying like, this isn't therapy. This is like a peer support and maintenance and prevention resource. So that was a hurdle for me. The initial response from people was, oh, but there's no appointments. You don't have to create a login, or there's no software updates, or it's not an app that you download. And it was a huge learning curve because there were only a few like reigning telemental health champs at the time. And because what we were doing didn't fit exactly in with what they were doing, I realized pretty early on that like communicating our differentiating like competitive advantages was going to be a challenge, because people kept thinking like, how come a therapist isn't texting me back in real time? There was like that kind of misconception that I had to fight. It was positive, like the response was positive, but it was very slow traffic. And there was a lot of like customer service back and forth explaining to people, like they would say, oh, it must be broken because a trained crisis counselor didn't call me. And I'm like, that's literally not what we do.
Yeah. I imagine also that's like the figuring it out phase. Like, how do we like position ourselves? How do we market our ideas? When I was still working in a therapeutic practice, I mean, gosh, that's like maybe it's over a decade ago. That's when the idea of remote therapy wasn't first introduced. I mean, it's been something that's going on for a long time. But the idea of doing things over the phone, over the internet back then, so let's say like 11 or 12 years ago, was like really just starting to emerge. And a lot of it had to do with a therapist could volunteer to do distance therapy with people who live in like northern BC to help marginalized communities get access. And people wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. No way. Like there's no, you can't do it. Whereas now there's therapists who work, let's say in BC, who are doing therapeutic practice with people who live in New York City. And things have changed so much. What do you think has led to that change? So if you're saying in 2007 or 17 you started this thing, now it's 2021 and you've got a viable business that's making big change. What's happened in that time?
Well, one thing that I want to actually go back and mention is, you were like, oh, it's so good you didn't wait for permission and stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't want to come off like I'm some like DIY maven, like because I had to be, not because I wanted to be. So don't get it twisted. I went to every single person working in mental health asking for help, and pretty much everybody said no. So I was like, shoot, it's kind of like a band where you go shop to all these labels and managers and agents and everyone's like, you guys suck. And you're like, well, okay, then I'm just going to have to do it myself. So I wanted to clarify, like I purposely sought out help, but like you said, if it's pre the way telehealth is now, even 4 years ago, a lot of people were kind of had that hesitance that you mentioned. They're like, well, I don't really know if that's going to be legit. And I think one thing that's changed a lot, obviously the COVID thing has had a big influence on people's acceptance of doing anything digitally. But also I'll say there's been a slow yet gradual understanding that we haven't been meeting the rising demand for mental health care. Like, because keep in mind, 2015, do you know how many folks were like puffing up saying, well, we actually have a good enough system and we're helping everybody and we don't have any problems. And now come 2021, I think there's a lot more awareness around realizing like there are gaps. We need to address them.
Yeah. And that puffing up of the chest, it's like, I get it. Like, when you're so dedicated to being in the space of helping people, you want to do the right thing. And there can be this sense of like, we're not doing this. But then when there's we're not doing a good enough job. But then when there's outside voices or even inside voices saying, hey, we're not doing a good enough job, I can see people being like, and I can understand, and I've probably been that way myself, where you're like, we're doing the best job that could possibly be done until you're shown that you're not. And that's why I think this is such a compelling story. And also I like that. Thank you for giving us that clarification that you actually went to people. And I like how you talked about it as a band perspective, because I actually want to circle back to the whole kind of like band DIY thing that like most bands would be like, please put out our record, major label. And like if the major label is like, that's awesome, you'd be like, great. People usually are DIY because everything else has failed up to that point. Like you had to do it yourself because there was no other option. So that's the story here.
Dude, every entrepreneur that I meet, I'm always curious. I'm like, what's your story? What's your background? And most people have, my version of the story is unique, but most people say like, I tried to work here and then I got laid off, and then I tried to apply here and then they didn't have a place for me. And it's like failure after rejection after door slammed in their face. And you get to a point where you're like, well, screw it. I just have to make my own job. I have to hire myself because I can't, like for me, having tattoos was really getting in the way of my career. Mm-hmm. Like I was being turned down from a lot of opportunities because of the way that I looked. And I was like, well, shoot, what am I supposed to do? The places that would allow me to tour for half the year didn't want me to have tattoos. And the places that were cool with me having tattoos didn't want me gone half the year working remotely. So I kind of did get to a point where I wish I could say like, I woke up and I was like, I'm going to do this myself. Screw everybody. But it was really only after 100 rejected job applications that I decided to really pursue it,
Yeah, man. And that's where so much of great business leaders, innovative businesses, like actual innovation of any industry comes from. It's from total rejection, people not having the vision, or people having the vision and not willing to take the leap. All of those things. In a lot of ways, it's a classic story. And then in a lot of ways, it's a unique story to you. Let's talk about when it turned the corner, though, from kind of being this, you launched it and there's a lot of like user confusion. When did everything click and people got it and you were able to meet the demand?
None of those things happened at the same time. So I think when I realized that this wasn't going to be like just a volunteer project, because I had been volunteering in the mental health space since like 2011. So in my mind, like Not a Therapist was a volunteer project. I was working full time and working on Not a Therapist. So I was like 1 million hours a week, unpaid. And then I was trying to recruit volunteers, which it's hard to find people to work for free. And then when I started Cope Notes, I still was like, this is a volunteer project. I do need to charge because now I'm doing something that actually costs, like there's SMS hard costs. Like I need somebody to pay for that. And I was still treating it like a volunteer project until this was like 5 months in. I actually we were touring at the time, and I met, a few people who signed up on their own for individual subscriptions. And I was like, okay, well, that person's spending $10 this month, and that helps cover some of our cost. I need a lot more people to do that in order to pay for this. And then there was one tour where I met 3 different people within the span of a week, that all requested an enterprise level subscription. So one was like an addiction treatment facility that was like, hey, can you support like 600 people? And I was like, well, shoot, I don't know how to say this, but I'm sending all these messages myself. Like I'm pasting, I'm just repurposing marketing software, basically. Like I don't really have software. And then shortly after that, I had a request for a foster care client in Iowa who's actually still a client to this day, who said, can you support a couple thousand kids? And I was like, well, I just said no to a 600 person guy. So there's no way I could do anything for you guys yet. And then I had a request. This was all in 1 week. I had a request from a woman who worked with the school district of Dallas. And she said, can you support 156,000 students? And I said, ma'am, I have a full-time job doing creative, and this is a volunteer project for me. And even if I could do it, it would wind up costing the school district like millions and millions of dollars in order to to afford that just based on like the price per subscription per month. And she said, I know. I just wanted to see if you would be able to meet that demand. I was like, are you kidding me? That's a real question. And it made me realize that the demand wasn't just a few people that I met here and there. The demand might be on like an institutional level, like on a community wide level.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, the school district can't work with vendors who don't have a full-time CEO.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I'm going to do the wildest thing I've ever done and quit my job to be a full-time CEO to pursue this. So spoiler alert, we don't have a contract with Dallas ISD yet, but it woke me up to realizing how large the need could be.
Mm-hmm. How many employees do you have now?
Not a lot. Like a lot of the best advice that I've gotten in the startup phase is keep people contract until you need W-2.
Mm-hmm.
So especially at startups, you'll have, you might have 20 hours a week or 30 hours a week for some people. You rarely have 40 hours worth of work per week for someone on a multi-year basis until you know what the heck you're doing. So I've been very careful not to waste people's time. So right now we have literally 3 full-time in-house employees on payroll. And then we have a majority of the people helping us, probably 7 to 15 or so people who are project basis. So they'll come in and work on a sprint with us, and then they'll take some time off. And as we grow, we're pulling from that contract pool in-house.
Yeah. So you have roughly around 20 people who are active within the business at any given time, would you say?
At any given time, it's based on the sprints that we're doing. Cause sometimes they overlap. Like let's say a project takes 4 people, and then you're doing another project that takes 4 people. All of a sudden you have 8 contractors working.
Yeah.
And then there are some times where we have no sprints where it's just our in-house people. It's kind of hard to explain.
No, it makes perfect sense. The reason I'm asking you about this is like, I want to empower people to understand like starting a business doesn't mean you're like, oh, I've got a business and now I'm the CEO and I've got this office and I've got all these people. And this is my ancient business person voice. I don't know why I'm using it, but the idea being that like you can create something super impactful and you can be the CEO of a company that literally has, including you, 3 employees, and that company can do massive revenue, and beyond the massive revenue, it could be creating like a huge positive impact. It doesn't have to be this traditional idea of business where it's like, we've got all these vice presidents and this and that and that and this. The modern idea of business, and even actually I'd say even traditional idea of business, is really it could just be a few people who utilize really strong contractors at the right time in the right way. It's just about how strategic you are about building your business. With that being said, tell us about how modern day Cope Notes works. What is the service and how does it work?
So it's a heck of a lot cooler than my initial idea. So actually first, when I was running Cope Notes, for example, there's a ton of differences and we don't have to walk through all of them, but one that will illustrate the gulf between the version that I started and the version that exists today was before I would write text messages, 1 text per day, and then I would put them in a Google sheet and then go onto my SMS marketing software that was literally just a web app that I went to online and paid like per text credit to use. It was ridiculous. And I would paste in the text that I wrote in my Google sheet, and then I would pick a random time myself and then schedule it to be delivered to the entire list at once. And then if people wanted to sign up, they filled out a form on our website and I would copy their information and paste it into our essay. I mean, dude, I was making so many errors every day. And so now we have a living text library that has hundreds upon hundreds of text messages that are written by peers with lived experience. They are reviewed, edited, and approved by our clinical oversight panel of mental health professionals who are making sure that the texts are applicable across demographic, they're trauma informed, they're based on proven psychological principles. And then we have a scheduler that we built that will randomly select a day, a user, a text, and a time, and schedule it out so no 2 people ever get the same text at the same time. We use artificial randomization to like choose the sequence of text for different people and to determine relevance based on their feedback. And then when people text back, we have our oversight panel making live edits to the library based on if someone says like this didn't make sense or this wasn't relevant to me. So we have like this living, breathing machine that's sending thousands upon thousands of text messages every day. And I look at it now and it's like so nuanced and robust and automated. And I just think like if I would have kept trying to do it the way that I was doing it, um, I would have I would have 20,000 angry people.
Yeah, totally, totally. So, do you have any sense of, since the service started to where it is now, to the modern iteration of it, how many people you've been able to interact with and provide this kind of positive support for?
It's just shy of 20,000. So we have we count three things on our website publicly, and it's to hold ourselves accountable to our impact. So we measure text exchanged, countries reached, and lives impacted. And lives impacted means the total number of people who have used Cope Notes at some point. And I think right now we're in the mid 19,000s. So hopefully by the time this publishes, we'll be right around 20 or beyond.
That's awesome, man. So, has there been any pushback or any kind of gatekeeping from the mental health professional world?
Yeah, for sure. I actually had, it's kind of sad. I've had friends who are like career therapists who have said, like, you're trying to take therapists' jobs by putting out a tool like this. And these are people that I've known interpersonally for a long time, like through church or through music, and people I had healthy relationships with. And they're like, I don't want to support you. It's like a they took our jobs kind of moment. And I've always tried to explain to people like Cope Notes is a supplemental resource. We focus on prevention and intervention. If you are in treatment, Cope Notes is great, like a great daily resource for you to supplement that. If you're not in treatment, it's a great way to normalize help-seeking behaviors and get you to reduce some of that self-stigma and engage with those existing supports. And it's been tough because I don't view mental health as like this competitive business battlefield where people are duking it out for market share. I like coming from the patient side of things, I need providers to coordinate with each other, you know, for the sake of people like me.
It's interesting you say that because you put a dollar sign behind anything, and not even a dollar sign. You put prestige, positional power, influence, any of those things. Any of that stuff behind anything, it becomes a competition. And I'm not against competition. I'm a super competitive person. I typically am competitive with myself. Like I always like to beat my last things that I did and push myself, but I'm also competitive. Like, you know, there's companies that would be competitors of Cadence. I want to I want to push ourselves further. I want to become a better service. I think competition by in and of itself is not a negative thing. When it's competition that causes harm to people, that's where I get an issue. So for example, trying to shut something down or not support something like Cope Notes to me seems like a harmful activity. And from a therapeutic perspective, you've got that do no harm mentality. Very specifically, what I like about Cope Notes is, you know, I have personally and professionally known a lot of people where going to therapy or going to a peer support group is actually a barrier. The getting up and leaving your house or doing these things or finding the time. Let's say someone who's working full time is a single parent, so they also have a kid. Like going and actually going to therapy or going to a peer support group, it's a barrier. And something like Cope Notes, and then also kind of the rise of online counseling or phone counseling, that's creating accessibility for parts of our community that have been marginalized. So I only see it as a benefit.
Dude, we've been really big on health equity since day one. Like one of the reasons why we chose text over an app, not only is engagement like literally 50% higher than iOS app notifications, like text messages completely womp all app notifications. But beyond that, the accessibility component is something I didn't even consider until I started looking into some of the metrics around SMS in general and like modern digital communication, because everyone likes to think that other people have a similar setup. Like I have an iPhone. When I meet someone with an Android, I'm like, huh? What? but I have an iPhone. It like does not compute.
Mhm.
And as a result, we forget that 2.5 billion people, 1/3 of the world's population, rely on non-smart devices, on flip phones and track phones and pay-as-you-go phones that cannot download apps.
Mhm.
And then there are people like my biological dad, who is 70 years old, and my brother bought him an iPhone and he doesn't know how to use it.
Yeah.
So all he's doing is sending and receiving text messages and phone calls. That's it. So even in America, 11% of the US population rely on a cellular device that can't access smartphone dependent apps. So like from
Mhm.
day one, we've been like, this is an accessibility issue. Where what digital health has been saying to Americans is, if you don't have the newest iPhone, then you can get in line and wait with everybody else. But all the people who spent $1,300 can download this nifty app and then never use it. It's like
Yeah.
so
And
unfair.
well, and could I add something to that?
Go for it.
So, what traditional therapeutic practice has been saying to people who can't do things in person is, well, if you really want it, if you really want to get better, you'll do it. And I think both about from working in a outpatient setting, and I also think about working my own experience in working with peer support groups like 12-step groups, is that idea. It's like, well, if someone like, like won't get up and shower and get out and do it, well, they don't really want it. They don't really want to be cleaner. They don't really want to get better. And I don't know, there's this real old school idea of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and like go and do it. It's like, yeah, I don't know, like that just works for like a lot of people, but not everybody. And realistically, I want like mental health support. I want addiction support. I want these things to be accessible to everybody in whatever way works for them. And I'm not critiquing old school therapy, like in-person therapy or in-person peer support groups, because like they've worked and they continue to work and it's a great model. But what I don't like is that like really knee-jerk reaction. Well, they just don't want it bad enough, because I disagree with that wholeheartedly.
Dude, I'm really glad you brought that up because I spent an incredibly long time in treatment. And
Mm,
I had people saying, like, I've had friends say, like, well, it wouldn't take so long if you were actually trying or applying
mm,
yourself, or if you actually, like you said, if you actually wanted to get better. And it was excruciating for me to hear that because I was putting almost all of my available time and energy and effort into trying to get better. And I just kept hitting a wall. And a friend of mine put this in a great way. She said, if you were to give somebody a button the easy button, like from Staples, she said, if you were to give that to someone and you take it and say, if you hit this button, your whole life will be better. You won't feel depressed anymore. You won't feel um, anxious or afraid or debilitated by anything. You won't hallucinate anymore. You won't self-harm anymore. And I'll just leave it right here on your dresser. And this person is in their bed and they are too depressed to get out of bed. Or, like in my case, I grew up with schizophrenia. So I would hallucinate, I had a lot of auditory and visual hallucinations. So if you tell me the button is there and I'm hallucinating guards in
mhm.
front of it, and then you tell me that it's because I don't want to get better that I'm not pressing the button, like it's completely discounting the nature of the struggle that the person is experiencing. And it feels so cruel and dismissive. So I'm glad you brought it up because I don't often bring it up because the reaction to us talking about this kind of thing is people saying, well, you're just making excuses for people who aren't applying themselves. And it's like, brother, if you've actually felt that kind of pain, you would get it, you know?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, especially now in this age where like every company in the world is like, we value mental health and da da da. It's like I try not to be cynical about this, and the cynical side of me does come up where it's like every company now is talking about being inclusive and diverse, and they all are celebrating pride, and they're all talking about mental health. It's like, man, how much of this is just garbage marketing? Like, no, but like you don't really care. But it's not that they don't care, because I don't want to say that's true, because there are people within those companies that care, and the marketing point is a valid thing. They are marketing themselves for sure. But also I'd say the business world and our society in general has changed along those ways for the most part of people wanting to be more inclusive and wanting to be more diverse and wanting to embrace those sides. But the key here is not knowing how. The talk is one thing. And I think that talk is mostly genuine. It's the learning how to walk the walk. And that's why I think something like Cope Notes is like a good example of, okay, people don't know how to walk the walk. They want to walk the walk. They don't know how to do it. That's where things like, if you want it bad enough, you'll go to a meeting, you'll go to a therapist. No, you don't know. So here's someone who's going to create, who's going to innovate. And then you're going to help people walk the walk. I view something like Cope Notes as basically people not knowing how to take the next step. And then it takes someone who's an affected population to say, okay, you guys can't figure it out. I'm going to figure it out for you. And I'm going to figure it out for us. So that's why I think like what you're doing is so powerful. Can I make a music analogy?
I need you to now. I'm so curious.
All right. So when I was younger, I was super active in punk and hardcore and put out tons of records and did all this stuff. And then I didn't for a long, long time. And there are professional reasons for it because I got really busy with work and really focusing on like my daughter and focusing on building up my company and all that. And there were personal reasons where I was going through an extremely like difficult time, like really personally difficult time. Last year, I put out the first record that I put out in many, many, many years. And I didn't know what I was doing. It wasn't like, no, but it wasn't the time of when I could put out a record on a record label. And also I'm not like going to go out and tour for like 10 months out of the year, all that. And I was talking to my friend Rich Rossi, and shout out to Rich and shout out to Death Wish over at Death Wish. And I was like, dude, how do I put out a record now? Like, what do I do? And he walked me through it. But the core of what he just kept saying was, your goal is to always think, how do I make this as easy as possible for people to get this music? And everyone listens to music in different ways. Some people listen on Spotify. Some people listen on iTunes. Some people still buy CDs. Some people buy vinyl. Some people listen on YouTube. And basically he was like, whatever is the way that people listen to music, that's where you want your music to be. Doesn't mean they're going to listen to it, but it needs to be there. And it was so much easier to put out a record now than it ever was, because it's basically just like, think of every single way that people listen to music and just make sure your record is there. And yeah, it was a cool way of doing it. And it makes me think of Cope Notes, because it's basically like, how do people need help? Just think of every single way people need help and then innovate to make sure that's possible.
I like that a lot, especially because, I mean, even in the last 10 years, look at how much phones have been demonized. Like one of the first things that I hear from people who are like, because you asked if I ever get kind of kickback and hesitance from people around what I'm doing. That's a common one, is like, so you want people to use their phones are why they're depressed. And I always think to myself, that's not true. Like if you're in a kitchen, you can make the healthiest meal or the unhealthiest meal depending on what you have in your kitchen, right? If you don't have fresh produce, you might not make something that's that healthy. So all I'm doing is making sure that people's kitchens have fresh produce in it. That's it. Like, don't say that the kitchen is bad. And cell phones have been very problematic, but not the phone itself. It's the way that we use it, which is why there are a lot of like app success metrics that I shy away from when we're looking at how people engage with Cope Notes. An app might say, oh, people are only spending so-and-so minutes on this app per day. And I think I want people to spend as little time as possible engaging with their phone anyway. Like, I don't need people to spend 30 minutes in a Cope Notes text thread. There are some days when you have your hands full and you see a text message from Cope Notes, you read it, it takes you 9 seconds to read the message, but then you chew on it and you think about it and you talk about it with someone else. And then it pops into your head on your drive home that day. And then 3 weeks later, someone mentioned something related to it. So the real work of Cope Notes doesn't take place in your phone. We're just using your phone because that's what you're holding. The real magic of it takes place long after the message was delivered.
Totally. So one thing that we haven't gotten into, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask people to go to your TED Talk, and we're going to make sure it's all linked to it, because we haven't gotten too much into like what Cope Notes is today. So if someone signed up with the service, what are they engaging with? So if you can just give me a couple minutes on that, so that people listening can have enough information to go back to the TED Talk.
Yeah. So today, Cope Notes, I mean, it's like I said, it's just a much better version. So we're using daily text messages to improve your mental and emotional health, but really the sciencey stuff behind it is where you might have read about this actually, like cognitive restructuring and neuroplasticity. So the text messages act as EMIs, or ecological momentary interventions, and they interrupt negative thought patterns with a catalyst for positive thought, so that over time your brain learns to think in healthier patterns. So all we've been doing for years and years is thinking, how effective can we make this one thing? And a lot of times people will say, what, you started out doing text messages, now 3.5 years later you're still doing text messages? And I say yes, because all of our competitors, and I use that term in figurative air quotes because I'm not a huge fan of the term, but all of the other folks who are providing similar digital mental health resources, they are saying, well, we're going to have a full suite, and there's going to be modules and video trainings, and they're all about like this multi-platform, like make it all the bells and whistles. And through my research, I've found that making something sexy isn't the same as making it effective. So we kind of chose from day one, we're not going to branch out into any other multi-platform thing until we are the best mental health texting resource on the planet. So short of that, any time that would be spent building out like a video training series or an app that lets you chart your whatever, no, we're going to get better and better and better at the one thing that we're good at. And that's proven to be really effective, because now, instead of us having to build like benefits programs contact us and say, can we plug your thing in? Because you do your one thing well. So it might sound after 3.5 years that we're still doing the same thing. And I can say that you're partially right, because we are doing mental health texting, but we're doing it so much better than anyone else.
Yeah, man. I think that's the key. Like, you don't try and be good at everything. Try and be good at that one thing that makes a huge difference. That thing that you're an expert at. All right, so let's turn to you. Can I ask you a couple questions about you?
Yes, please.
All right. So, what have you learned about yourself that you didn't know at the beginning of your journey down this path?
A lot of stuff. One thing that sticks out to me is that I can perform a task if the end justifies the means. So I have done a lot of things that I haven't really been super interested in order for Cope Notes to succeed. Like I've learned coding, and I'm not great, but I've had to learn stuff about coding and HR and legal and finance. And it's stuff that I used to, like you grow up and you're a punk and stuff, and you're like, yo, screw the man. And like, I don't want to learn about all that stuff. And then you get to a point where you're like, I have to draft onboarding materials to set a fractional CFO up for success. And it becomes interesting because the work itself might not be your favorite thing to do, but if it means that Caitlin in Ohio is going to grow up with a mom because her mom used Cope Notes to get through some challenging period of her life, then yeah, I want to draft the best onboarding materials I've ever drafted. So I've learned that the idea that I had in my head of like a stiff businessman doesn't have to exist. Like you can be a version of a leader in an organization that wears t-shirts and says dudes and shows empathy, without having to be this like cruel, ruthless, money-driven monster,
Yeah, 100%. I love that. Tell us about your musical background.
I grew up like everyone in our generation, or most everyone in our generation that got beat up in elementary school, listened to like Slipknot and System of a Down and Linkin Park and Korn. Like I grew up in that new metal era, so I listened to a lot of rap, and then a lot of like that rap rock kind of stuff. And then got really into radio rock, like Chevelle and Seether and Red, 10 years. And then slowly, actually not slowly, one day on MySpace, I came across Devourment, which is like a slam band. And then from that point on, I just became fascinated with like really heavy, brutal music. So I started my first band in 2009. I had no idea what I was doing. But I took it real seriously, and we got signed to Nuclear Blast and E1 in 2012. I think we put out our first record through the label in 2013. That was like black and death metal. So it went from doing that style of music to fulfilling our contract and starting a new band that's a lot more like the music I listened to growing up, like the new metal and alternative metal, like Deftones-y type stuff. So it's been really fun to go from like listening to Eminem to like touring and doing metalcore, and then like black and death metal with all the Animal Bones and Candles and everything, and then going from like signed with a beast manager and label and team to independent, making the music that I want and dancing around on stage instead of being tough.
I love it, man. I also love that you said our generation, or that you kind of implied that I was part of your generation, when I am significantly older, and all of the things that you were talking about were happening post college for me. So thank you. I feel so I whatever regiment I'm doing to keep myself looking young is clearly
You're aging
working.
like wine.
Thank
That's
you.
crazy.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay, I got 3 more questions for you.
Yeah, buddy.
All right. So first question. Let's do a current top 3, and it doesn't have to be like this is forever. It's just right now. I see some Jordan 1s behind you. Current top 3 sneakers.
Well, one of the most elusive pairs that I've always loved are the Shattered Backboard 1.0s. Favorite. Those are the Jordan 1s. Also, the Jordan 3 Black Cement. I don't have either of these pairs. And those are so iconic. I mean, they've been on my list for my whole life, basically. And then a third, you know what? I'm going to be that guy, because I really like these, even though I'm not really a name brand type of person. Like with clothing and stuff, like I haven't gotten really into Supreme or Off-White or anything like that.
You wear Jordan 1s. That's like the most like name brandy thing out there.
I know. It's only with sneakers for some reason.
Okay.
I've never gotten into it with like the streetwear stuff.
Okay.
But for some reason, the Off-White Prestos from the 10 collection, the Nike Off-White Prestos, where they're like a cream and black color, and then they have those obnoxious green and orange laces. I love them to death. And they're like $2,000 resale, so heaven knows if I'll ever be graced with a pair.
Well, listen, we're in the great world of podcasting. Maybe someone will hook you up. All right.
That'll be a dream.
All right. Second question. What are the 3 bands that you think are most related to the work that you do with Cope Notes?
That's a really good question. I don't want to pick my own, because that's not fair. I don't know that I'm going to have a really good answer. Well, I know one band that comes to mind is Meshuggah, and that's only because of how calm I feel when I listen to Meshuggah. It's like this weird meditative, droney, fascinating pattern weave that you almost can't be depressed or anxious or frustrated or anything, at least for me, when I hear Meshuggah, because it's so involving that I can't think about what's going on in my life and listen to the music. I have to pick one. So I like Meshuggah for how engaging they are. It might not be for everybody. Also, there's a band called Cloud Kicker. Have you heard of them?
Never.
It's an instrumental band. I'm pretty sure it's just one guy. And it's very similar. There's like complicated patterns, and it's instrumental. Really, they have like chill parts and then really interesting patterns. So probably that. And then I don't have a real good third one. Like I don't know many bands that do mental health well. There's a lot of like, there are bands who might mention stuff about mental health, but they don't, the execution might have a little more negative of an outcome than they are expecting, because it's not like really consciously sharing about the stuff. So I don't really have a good third band at the moment.
Can I tell you the three that would apply to Cadence?
Please.
Youth of Today. Do you like Youth of Today?
Somehow, so I grew up straight edge and never listened to Youth of Today.
Man, I got to tell you, listen to We're Not In This Alone, but don't, like, the recording's rough, but listen to the songwriting. The songwriting is like unreal songwriting. And also for that time, the lyrics were like really good lyrics. Uniform Choice, Minor Threat, and Youth of Today, Uniform Choice, and Minor Threat. Without those three bands, Cadence wouldn't exist, and I don't know if I would either. All right, last question for you. We get all sorts of people that listen to this podcast. It's a mix of like pure business people, so people who are in the corporate world, but there's like artists, there's athletes, there's skateboarders, there's punks, there's people from the metal scene. And it's been cool because we're getting like a pretty diverse audience, but they all come here for one reason. And really the podcast is about leadership. And all we've been talking about today is leadership. And not leadership in the traditional sense where it's like, like, I'm a leader, but it's just people who are out there willing to take a leap and do something that makes a difference. And that's certainly you. So anything that you want to say to, what could you say to people who feel they could make a difference, but they haven't taken the leap yet?
I want to keep it real. It's going to be harder than you think, but more worth it than you think.
I love that. That's a great place to end. So listen, Johnny, thank you so much for being on the show. Anything that you'd like to say as we're closing off?
I'm trying to use LinkedIn more. So if you guys can hold me accountable to that and add me on LinkedIn so I have a reason to engage with it more, do it. And then also, I wanted to mention that if anyone has listened to this and thought like, well, this was cool, but mental health isn't really my thing. I'm not, I don't really have anything going on and I couldn't use a mental health resource. I want to just push back on that and say that if you have a brain, you could benefit from any mental health resource. And I encourage you to go to our website, check it out. And if it's not for you and you have a miracle brain that, there's nothing that could use polishing, then please pass it along. We have gift subscriptions for friends or family members. And I think probably everyone listening knows somebody who could benefit, if not themselves directly.
Awesome. And what a great way to end off. So thank you so much, Johnny. And everyone, please check out Cope Notes. And what's the name of your current band?
Prison.
Check out Prison?
Oh, yeah.
Check out Prison. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Johnny. And Spencer, drop the beat.